Hey, Story Makers, Mel here, and I've got a special guest, my friend, and dad and priest or pastor, and all. Jack, can I start that again?
No problem. And I noticed, what? It's good. We have to start it. Hold on, I'm going to end this.
Hey, Story Makers, Mel here, and I am inviting you into a new conversation with my friend, Matthew Hoskinson. Hi, Matthew. Thank you so much for being with us today. We're so excited for this topic around grace and parenting and girls.
Absolutely. It's a delight to be here.
Well, Matthew is a jack of all trades and has so many amazing and wonderful skills, but currently he is the VP over at City to City of the New York City Leadership Development and Operations, all the things. And not only just that, he also is offering spiritual direction, and he preaches on Sundays and all sorts of different pulpits around the city. It's so great to have you, and thank you for taking the time. Just in all of the things I just described now, thank you for taking 30 minutes to be with StoryMakers. You offer so much wisdom and grace to all of us, and we're so excited to have you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Love StoryMakers. Happy to do it.
Well, years ago, Matthew met my husband, Jake, who happens to be a priest here in the city. And during the pandemic, I know your family jumped into the StoryMakers adventure, and that's where we all got connected. And, you are a father of 5, and you have been offering grace and shepherding your kids through faith for many, many years. And so I'm so happy that you're with us today.
Yeah, I mean, StoryMakers was such a lifeline. We were at that time living in Brooklyn, which we felt a little bit like we were in exile because we'd been in Manhattan, and now we were like way in deep South, like not cool Brooklyn. And we got a box from StoryMakers about a week into the shutdown and opened it up, and it just gave life and renewed our family. So yeah, we love what you're doing.
Thank you so much. Well, friends, as we love to do here at StoryMakers, everyone's got a story, and God is working through each and every one of us, and there's a redemptive narrative at play all the time. And so we want you to get to know Matthew a little bit more, and I'm going to ask him a few questions so that we can get curious and see how God has been moving in his life. So Matthew, will you tell us a little bit about yourself? Like, where are you from? Were you a church kid? How did you get hooked up into God's story?
Yeah, so I grew up in the Detroit area, which I wear very proudly down to my Shinola watch. I'm a proud Detroiter and cheer for all of the Detroit teams, even when they're terrible. I like to describe myself as the biracial son of blue collar parents.
Awesome.
So my dad is a white American who was in the army during Vietnam, but was stationed in South Korea, where he met my mom, and upset all 4 of my grandparents by marrying and then moving back to the States. I was born in the late 70s, so I'm a late Gen Xer. And my parents were not church-going people when I was first born, but then my dad really kind of, a spark was lit in his heart, and so we started going to a Missouri Synod Lutheran church for a number of years. So that was kind of my earliest faith formation, was like preschool until early elementary. And then we ended up in an independent fundamentalist Baptist church, which is a very big shift.
Yeah, from Luther's small catechism to, I don't know what that others.
Yeah, it was the other side of the spectrum, that's for sure. So lots of lovely people in both places, but just a very different perspective on God. Going from the one to the other, and something that took really years to even kind of figure out, like, how do those pieces relate to one another. But I think, even from early Sunday school days at the Lutheran church, and then into my years at the Baptist church, just had this innate sense of God's reality, God's existence, and of God's interest in my life. Now, in the more fundamentalist realm, it kind of took a negative turn. And like, God is interested that I stop messing up so much. And so that became kind of a malformed understanding of God. And grace was something that I would have to earn. I literally thought I had to save myself. Jesus had done so much for me, but now it's up to me to save myself.
Yeah.
So anyway, going into ministry made sense for a lot of reasons. But one thing, as I really started to understand the gospel, like in college and seminary, I realized, like, wait a second, I don't have to be a pastor to please God. Like, I could do anything because God really does love me. So it's been quite the journey along the way.
That's awesome. Well, I love your description of the maladaptive form of understanding of God's view of us. You know, I don't think it was until, well, my husband was in seminary. I grew up in the church, non-denoms, but I also sort of had this feeling, that this perspective that I was in the earning space, like you're always earning grace. And when my husband was in seminary, that's when I realized, it's like, oh, grace is for us all the time.
Yes.
And then when you read the Bible, you're like, oh, people fail all the time. And then God's like right there capturing and coming back and pursuing. And so he's in the constant pursuit, and we are on the receiving end of that. And that's just such an incredible shift and a way to engage in relationships and all the things.
Absolutely.
So one of the things we're always curious about is childhood and the way you look back to it. Were there stories that really captivated your imagination as a kid? And did they have anything to do with the Bible?
Yeah, I mean, as a kid, probably the stories that captivated me the most were Calvin and Hobbes comic strips. I mean, I was the compliant kid. Like my older sister, God rest her soul, I mean, she was like the outward rebel. I was the compliant rebel. So I think I just took delight in Calvin and Hobbes because Calvin was this rebel that I would not allow myself to be, but always kind of getting into a mess or into trouble, and then Hobbes is the voice of reason, you know. But I mean, to this day, like, my son has just finished reading through all 3 volumes of my 3 volumes of Calvin and Hobbes, and I'm like delighting in these stories and saying, oh, they're so inappropriate, but they're so great.
Well, we talk about art being the back to the heart, and I think humor could be applied in the same way too, and building connection, especially with your kids, and especially, I would say, with teens. So Matthew has 5 wonderful children, and they're like a spectrum of ages. And you don't have any littles, but you've got some young adults, you know, throughout, you've got a whole spectrum. Matthew, can you tell us a little bit about how your sort of revelation around grace has impacted your parenting?
Yeah, I mean, it's a journey, to be sure. And I mean, I really have to start with my wife, Kimberly, because she, even though I was the one in seminary, like, she was the one whose understanding of God was much healthier, much more informed by grace. She lived with a freedom that I envied, and still to this day somewhat envy. That there are questions that rattle around in my brain that I'll mention them to her, and she's like, why are you worried about that? So she was a revelation to me, like, oh, someone can relate to God like this. And I think that was part of what attracted me to her in the first place. But then when we were expecting our first, and we started thinking about, oh my goodness, what is our home going to be like? And, there are things we inherited from our parents, both of us, that we really appreciated. And then there were things that we were like, well, we want to do a little different there. So what is that going to look like? And how do we relate to our parents if we do something different? So all those questions there. But one of the things that we just kept coming back to is God's grace to us. And we wanted to be parents who reflected the Father's grace in the way that we interacted with our kids. That would be communication first, that would be relationship first. and not, you know, conformity to some sort of external standards that were just imposed on them. That was really my upbringing. And I don't even think that was my parents so much as it was the church we were a part of, that I felt like I've got to conform to all these things for God to like me. We wanted to flip that dynamic for our kids and just say, well, we're going to prioritize the relationship. We're going to try to, you know, practice the very difficult 2 ears, 1 mouth thing, you know, so let's listen more than we just talk. And our kids can say whether we're doing a good job or not. But we're trying to lean that direction, I think.
Yeah, no, I see you guys doing that. Matthew and I we're near each other, so, and our kids interface with each other too, because I've got teenagers as well. Yeah, no, I think, you know, we talk a lot about this in Storymaker world, like plan to play, staying connected, relationship first, and it could, I think, you know, when you talked about having that like formation perspective, I think that is really key into grace and parenting, because if we don't imagine that God is in pursuit of us as grown-ups, then it's really hard to trust that God is in pursuit of our kids. And so then that's when things start to clamp down. And that's when we start to have a difficult time trusting that the stories are enough, you know, in of themselves. And so, you know, as we sort of hope to maintain connection, I think that that's really important for us. Yeah. And so, you know, as parents are navigating life, and especially the young parents just getting started, and there's so much anxiety that we all hold on to, what were some of the ways that you felt like God spoke to you or released you to kind of trust your kids, or, you know, just kind of lean into his grace over them in the young space?
Yeah, in the young space. Well, I mean, yeah, for us, the young space was moving to New York. So that was 2010, and we had 3 kids at the time. They were 7, 4, and 3. Almost 7, 4, and 3. And then Kimberly became expectant with number 4 shortly thereafter. So we really wrestled with that question about, are we really going to leave suburban South Carolina to move to New York? We never intended to live in South Carolina. Neither of us were from the South. It was a wonderful, wonderful church we were a part of, wonderful ministry that I got to work in, great schools, just all that stuff, right?
Yeah, a yard.
And yeah, it's like, what was that life like?
Yeah.
But I think one thing that stood out to me, and that continues to stand out to me, is it actually goes back to a sermon that my Baptist pastor preached when I was a kid. Like I remember this sermon where it's from Mark 4. It's Jesus asleep in the boat, and the disciples, of course, are just, you know, scared out of their minds.
Yeah.
Because of the storm that comes up on the sea, and they wake Jesus up. Don't you care, right? Don't you care? And Jesus walks out onto the deck, silences the wind and the seas, and then he turns and asks 2 questions. He asks them, "Why are you afraid?" Which, I mean, Jesus knows why they're afraid. We know why they were afraid. They thought they were going to die, right?
Yeah.
So the point was to open up their eyes to the fear that they are operating in. But then the second question is, how is it that you have no faith? And what I remember my pastor as a child in the Baptist church saying is the dichotomy between fear and faith. That we can operate out of one or the other, but not out of both.
Yeah.
And so those 2 questions come to mind when anxiety starts swirling in my heart about my kids at all ages. That, I mean, the presence of fear is an opportunity for me to reflect on the nearness of God, the presence of God, the goodness of God, and consciously to say, I trust you with this.
Yeah, no, you know, and I think that's such a great point. It's like, it's either you're operating out of fear or you're operating out of faith. And I mean, the disciples are like right next to Jesus.
Yeah, exactly.
So parents, you're not sitting right next to Jesus in a boat. So, have a little grace for yourselves too. I mean,
Absolutely.
it is a scary, I think that so much as the church, so much of the parenting messaging, I think, has come that we are obviously we're stewards and we want to care for our kids well and also point them to Jesus in the best ways that we can. But ultimately, their salvation and their bigger story is in the hands of their creator. And so I think when we get really tripped up with fear, in many of those moments, we have put ourselves in the creator seat and forgotten that we are creatures minding other creatures. But their salvation isn't in our hands.
Absolutely.
And we've got somebody bigger to handle that.
Yes.
I think the hot topic right now is Gen Z and Generation Alpha. So it sounds like you have both generations under your household.
Yes, we do.
Is anyone born 2010 on is Alpha, and anyone from 96 to 09, that's Gen Z. So I was wondering, Matthew, if you could share with us just a couple little tips as people have become so anxious about the digital age and anxiety and depression, and raising girls, what that has been like, and what you would share wisdom with families to take away. If you are afraid, maybe think about these couple of things.
Yeah, I think one of the big ideas that we've tried to operate with is we want to be ahead of our kids so that they can't shock us, so to speak. Like, I don't know that any of our kids like just try to shock us. Some kids are like that. My sister was like that. No doubt about that. I tried not to shock. That was my disposition. But we wanted to have the kind of relationship where they could say whatever, and it wouldn't shock us. So to that extent, we made decisions that were different than some of our friends, and I would honor that difference. And if other people choose to go differently, I get that. But for example, like having a smartphone, like we decided, well, partly because we live in New York, but we decided they would actually have them a little younger than so others might. Again, I mean, we had 11 and 12-year-olds commuting by themselves, so we wanted to know
on the subways. Yeah, you want to. I mean, yeah, that's real.
Yeah, so it's just this
going through Port Authority. You're like, I hope you make it.
Right, exactly. Wait, which station are you transferring at?
Why are you on the Upper East Side right now?
Right. I do not recognize that address.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, so our kids had smartphones pretty young, and we would utilize, whether it's Google's Family Link or the screen time on Apple to like have set down times or how much time they could be on certain things. The one like line that we did draw for them was just social media. That particularly can be so damaging to the psyche, and they're still forming. Their brains are still forming as early teens. So we said, yeah, that part's not healthy for you, and we want to help you by just not allowing that on your phones. And then once they did start having social media accounts, walking with, like Kimberly spent a lot of time just talking about social media, but more like less sort of lecture, here's 5 things you need to know, but more just in real time. Did you see this or this trending thing? And then engaging with how to process that whole thing. So yeah, we kind of, again, we wanted to like be ahead of them so that they couldn't shock us, rather than trying to protect them from everything and then be like, oh, like what's going to happen?
Well, I love what you're saying in particular, because I think what you're describing is really you're walking alongside them as guides, and we always talk about grown-ups being guides, and so you have to build the relationship and trust so that they will even allow for you to be a guide in that, and I think that was so wise of you all, because now, Jonathan Haidt and everybody's kind of looking at the kids from 2010 to 15 who were overexposed to social media and like the damage that caused in particular for girls. And so you guys are wisely ahead of the curve in protecting them from something that people weren't fully even aware was a dangerous thing for young adolescents. And now it's like, oh, well, yeah, that's not good for you. But even then, no one was really clear about like the dangers of what these applications could be for our girls. And so that's so wonderful. But I think that, being able to exemplify and share grace with your kids sort of requires a relationship for them to share where they're actually at or who they are, because you can't have those opportunities if you don't have strong communication with them.
Yes. We read a parenting book early on. It might have been even before, like when Kimberly was expecting our first. It was really early on, and it was like this self-published book from someone who lived locally. But the writer was a Christian and a counselor and a pastor, I think. And one of the big takeaways I had from that book was he had a list of like 8 different types of sentences, which I found fascinating, like, because I'm a nerd. So of course
I'm into it. I'm like, tell us more.
Right. But it's like simple declarations, right? Like, this is that or whatever. But then he talked about things like directives, which he differentiated from questions. Like, I can't remember the whole list, but what I remember his point in identifying all these different kinds of statements is, when you look at your parenting, what are your go-to modes of communication? And if you're leaning towards the directive side, certainly like when you have littles, there's a lot of directive like that. You're helping them learn what life is all about. But as they get older, that weight needs to start shifting towards open-ended questions. So not even just yes or no questions, but open-ended questions, and then providing the safety for them to be able to answer them without you shifting back to a directive. Like, well, the way you should be thinking about it is like this. Like,
exactly. I think, what you're describing is all the posture of parenting, right? And are we moving towards curiosity of like the other? And I think that's so important, right? With adolescence, it's like positioning ourselves in a way that's like, I'm curious about who you are, who you're becoming. Because then when they share things and you can say like, well, in the 80s or 90s, when I was a teen, I thought about that too. But it looked like this and it was so different. That's so interesting. And so then all of a sudden, like a door is open and that communication is there. So I think that's so wise. And right, language is so important. The way we're communicating is so important. And the way we express grace can be subtle and really meaningful without it being like right on the nose. Like, hey guys, are y'all doing your Bible studies? Just like the outcome driven approach, but having a more like a grace curious approach towards our kiddos.
And I think it honors what you were talking about earlier, the priority of God in this, that God is writing a story in their lives that's likely different from the story I'm trying to write with their lives. And in part, God is using their story to help craft mine as much as he's using mine to help craft theirs. So that posture of curiosity towards our kids assumes God is doing something, whereas the posture of direction assumes that I have to do something in order for God to do something. So again, there's that shift of like from fear to curiosity, like directives based on anxiety versus conversations based on, I know God is showing grace to this child. God has shown grace to this child and will continue to show grace to this child, irrespective of what they have done or will do, just like God shows grace to me, irrespective of what I've done or will do.
Yeah, that's such a great point. We are being shaped by our kids too. And God obviously uses all things in creation to draw us near to him and to shape our lives. And that's such a great point. Matthew, before we sort of close out today with our conversation, I just wanted to ask, has there been sort of an aha moment in your own parenting experience of grace towards you as a parent?
Yeah, I mean, there have been many, and sometimes it comes from one of my kids where they retell the good news of Jesus to me to help relieve my own anxiety about what's happening.
That's awesome.
Yeah, but I mean, again, going all the way back now to the last millennium, I remember Kimberly, when we were dating, said something to me that was just so powerful and so shaping. She said, "Let yourself live. Like, God is good. Let yourself live. This is a gift. So just enjoy this gift." So I feel like that's been like this lifelong sort of paradigm shift for me, to just relax into the presence of God and into the grace of God, and to know that he's going before in all things and in all relationships, and he's going before them and he's going before me and my parents and my in-laws and all of these things. It's good.
It's good all the time. Yeah, we talk about being free here in StoryMakers. Just be free. And what does that really mean? It's enjoying your forgiveness.
Yes.
We always say that here at Calvary St. George's. But that's so important and so amazing. Matthew, maybe you could just tell us a couple Bible stories that you would encourage parents to kind of take a look at if they're feeling afraid or anxious. What would be maybe a couple verses or gospel stories that you would, anything really?
Yeah, I mean, my go-to is the 23rd Psalm. I know it's almost cliche, which is a terrible thing to say, but
there's a reason, right?
There's a reason, exactly. Last week I was speaking to faith leaders in Indianapolis who were there for getting equipped for certain pastoral counseling cases. But then I was kind of the wrap-up session talking about their own care of their soul, and I ended up speaking on Psalm 23. I'm like, this psalm is for us because Jesus is the good shepherd of this psalm. So that poem 3,000 years ago, written by a Jewish man on a hillside somewhere, is ours because Jesus said that he's the good shepherd who laid down his life for us sheep. And so when I doubt that God's goodness is enough for my kids, or when I am fearful that maybe they're making a decision that I would not make, I go back to Psalm 23 and I see that last verse, can there be any doubt? Surely God's goodness and his steadfast love will not just follow me. The word means hunt me down. It will pursue me. It's on my heels every day for the rest of my life. And so in the midst of my own anxiety, that's one of my sentence prayers that I'll pray with a deep breath. The Lord is the one shepherding me. I lack nothing. I feel like I lack something. But if the God of the universe is actively shepherding my steps, his goodness is here right now, and I can relax into that.
I love that. That's such a great word. We've been talking a lot about breath prayer for our teens, and I think so much of it, when we talk about teens, we're really talking about ourselves and grown-ups. This should be applied to ourselves. But I would say everyone take a beat and check out Psalm 23 and just do breath prayer through that. Those kinds of the scripture tethers us, and and some of these the quiet times or all of these sort of practices can we can be maladaptive with these practices, that they're meant for our good, And they're meant to remind us and anchor us in that trust and to pull us back out of fear and back into faith. So thank you so much, Matthew, for your time. And we will catch you soon.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew.